Sure, it looks like that's it for the attendees. That's brilliant. I'm going to make a start. So welcome everybody to our webinar, Ransomware 2.0. Cyber criminals raise the stakes again. And thank you very much for taking the time out to sort of take part or to listen in from your busy schedule. So today we'll show you a little bit about, through a live hacking demonstration, some of the common ways that cyber attackers could infect your organization with ransomware. We'll also talk you through what you can do as a business to protect yourselves against this rise in cyber criminality and to avoid becoming a victim of double extortion ransomware. So a couple of quick introductions. My name is Maritz Kluter. I'm a cybersecurity consultant with Kingston Smith. I've been working in the IT and cybersecurity industry for the last few decades. And I'm sort of work quite closely with our clients to help improve their cyber resilience and help implement the necessary cybersecurity measures to protect them against this sort of threat. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Dan Ferrum. Dan is a very experienced cybersecurity incident handler and also a cybersecurity consultant with Kingston Smith. And Dan's going to be sort of working with me on this webinar to show you some of the technical side of how hackers hack, but also provide you with a little bit of insight in terms of what to do if you are actually affected by ransomware. So just before we start, I just wanted to point out that you can raise questions in the Q&A section. You should have a little Q&A button where you can ask questions along the way. And what we'll do, we'll sort of monitor the question and answers as they come up. If we can answer them as we go along, we will do. Otherwise, we will pick up the questions and answer at the end. And obviously, you'll have another opportunity to ask some more questions as well towards the end. Brilliant. So yeah, sorry, I forgot to show what we look like. There we go. So that's myself and Dan. So just also before we start, just a little bit about what we do as Kingston Smith from a cybersecurity perspective. We offer general consultancy services to our customers. So that includes anything from helping define what a cybersecurity strategy looks like, through to compliance type work. If you want to comply with ISO 27001 or PCI DSS or any of the other sort of standards that are out there, we can help with that. We provide audit and assurance services on the technical side. So whether you want to have, we do cybersecurity health checks for our customers, security compliance audits, we do supplier security audits as well, and a whole raft of other bits and pieces around audit and assurance. We also offer quite a lot of technical security services, pen testing, penetration testing. We do cyber essential certification, and also probably quite relevant to this specific session is we do incident response as well. So if our clients do have the unfortunate have the unfortunate sort of occurrence of having a cyber attack, whether that be ransomware or any sort of other cyber attack, we're able to help with that investigation and help them sort of deal with that sort of bad types of incidents that could happen. And then we do some work around industrial control systems as well, which is probably less relevant to this section. But yeah, just to give you a very brief overview of the kind of work that we tend to do. And we sort of draw on all this experience to sort of share this specific presentation with you. So just as a bit of an introduction, before we kick off with the demo itself, I just wanted to sort of highlight why it is so important for organizations to be concerned about cybersecurity. And I guess you wouldn't be on this call if you weren't concerned about cybersecurity. But I just wanted to share some real-world perspective on the effect of a cyber attack, especially the kind of effect it can have on medium and small organizations as well. So I think we're all pretty aware that cyber attacks are continually on the rise. We see a lot of it in the news. We see all kinds of organizations being affected, from sort of big corporations down to businesses like nurseries or schools as well. The UK Office for National Statistics reported last year that there's actually been a 23% year-on-year rise on reported cybercrime in the UK. But many believe this is only the tip of the iceberg because of what's actually being reported versus the actual crime or the actual attacks that are happening. And I think that the issue with cybercrime is it's actually relatively easy to commit as a cyber criminal, and it can be very lucrative because there's a very low risk of actually being caught. With both of the ease of sort of ransomware malware that can be rented, and also profit sharing arrangements between criminals and malware authors, ransomware continues to be quite lucrative from a revenue stream for criminals. And attackers are also now employing double extortion techniques. So firstly, they'll break in, they'll steal a lot of data from the victim, and then encrypt their data as well. So they're almost guaranteed a payout, because ultimately it's not just about getting the data back. They'll also threaten to release some of the data publicly. So if that's fairly sensitive data, it makes it really hard for the victim to say that they're not going to be paying for that ransom, paying the ransom, so they can at least get some guarantee from the attacker that the data won't be made public. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is a unique insight into the attacker psyche as well, based on an interview that was held with a Russian malware operator based in Siberia. So this individual was hiring malware from criminal cyber groups to generate an income so he can support his family. That was basically his day-to-day job. He woke up, went to sit in front of his computer, and just executed malware that he hired. So I just wanted to sort of raise a couple of interesting insights in the interview, and you'll see the link to the interview there if you want to read the full interview once you get this information after the session. So interestingly, operators actually put the deposit down to make use of malware, whether that's ransomware or any sort of other sort of malware. And then essentially what happens is if that ransomware attack is successful, that proceeds is split between the developers of the malware and the operators themselves. So what we're actually working with here is a proper organized crime, really. So you've got a very well-resourced criminal mastermind sitting there at the top of the pyramid, using quite a lot of willing foot soldiers to carry out some of the dirty deeds, and then ultimately reaping a lot of the rewards themselves. In speaking to the malware operator as well, they pick ransomware as their weapon of choice because it's one of the easiest bits of malware to monetize without being traceable. A lot of the times when they ask for ransom, they'll ask for ransom in Bitcoin, for example, which is ultimately not traceable. They also like to target EU and UK companies because they tend to be more profitable than the other parts of the world, mainly due to the strong privacy legislation and that fear of data breach fines as well, which makes organizations panic a bit and obviously then potentially pay up when the ransomware guy asks for lots of money. Sorry. So, and interestingly, the other bit that's probably worth highlighting is if a company has cyber insurance, then he believes they're almost guaranteed a payout. So yeah, it's quite an interesting perspective from a malware operator perspective, because to them it's their business, it's what they do for a day-by-day base, for a sort of day-to-day job, and ultimately they can pretty much attack the whole world. They're on the internet, and that means the world is at their fingertips. So that's sort of the perspective from the attacker side. Looking at it from the perspective of a victim, what we are seeing is that businesses are suffering real financial and operational losses, sometimes potentially with catastrophic results, such as operating for weeks without their IT systems, and not to mention many sleepless nights worrying about the ongoing viability of the business, and also in the worst case, the specter of having to close the business down permanently. So in our role as cyber incident responder, we witnessed firsthand some of the devastating impact that a single cyber attack could have. One real example we had just over the Christmas period, one of our clients' chief technical officers were woken up first thing on Boxing Day by his IT team, telling him that they cannot access their servers. They found that all of the data on their main business services had been encrypted along with the ransom note. So the ransom note can actually be seen. This is the copy of the actual ransom note that can be seen on the screen. And basically, basic text file that just says, "Hello, dear company name. Do not attempt to restore or move the files yourself. We've downloaded a lot of sensitive data from your network," and they sort of give a little bit of example of the kind of files they accessed. And they say, "Contact us now so we can discuss the ransom." So you could imagine the sort of feeling that they have, that you have as a manager or as a business owner when you sort of see this sort of information in there. So the note obviously then made it clear that the attackers had full access to servers, they've stolen data, and that if the company doesn't pay to have their data recovered, all the data will be released publicly. So to cut a long story short, the legal advice they got was to call in their cyber insurers, who ultimately paid the undisclosed ransom amount. However, what actually happened is all their servers were considered write-offs. They pretty much had to trash all their servers and rebuild them from scratch, rebuild pretty much their whole server infrastructure in their office. And that caused a massive amount of disruption to their operations, from which they're only really recovering now. And we're sort of talking 2 months on now from when this actually happened. The other scary bit actually is that the insurance company kicked off a forensic investigation, and they actually found that the compromise happened 15 days before the ransomware was triggered. And during that period, the attackers managed to gain access to the company's network and spent 4 or 5 days slowly but surely pilfering about 304,000 different files from those servers, which included personal data, commercial data, and intellectual property. So who actually knows where that data is now once they've got access to it? Who knows whether they've shared that with anybody? They've sort of given the guarantee that they haven't, but actually there's no guarantee that they have. And also, what we also see is this specific incident, the decision to trigger the ransomware on the 26th of December was not random. Attackers know when, well, obviously they know that it's a holiday period, and they do trigger some of these type of events to make sure that the company is caught off guard, which further maximizes their returns because it generates that panic within an organization. So hopefully this has sort of set the scene a little bit. Cybercrime is a massive problem for businesses, whether you're a big business, a small business, or associations. I don't think it's not going to go away, and if we stick our heads in the sand and hope for the best. So we really do need to do something about it more proactively. Cool, so on to the demonstration. So just to set the scene a little bit of what we're going to be doing, we've got an unwitting victim working for a fictitious company called Datamaniacs. They're a data analytics firm that provide marketing services to mid-sized companies. Our victim is a home worker who uses their own home computer to access their desktop computer in the office. This sort of arrangement was set up quite quickly during the first pandemic lockdown to allow office staff to work from home without the expense of actually issuing staff with company laptops. And now that everybody's comfortable working this way, everybody's quite happy with home working. The organization has changed a little bit, and home working arrangements are now a little bit more permanent, but they haven't changed the mechanism through which they do remote access. So what we were going to demonstrate now is we're going to show how easy it is for an attacker to trick our victim into giving up their username and password, and then what they would ultimately do with those details. I'm playing the role of the victim, and my colleague Dan is playing the role of the cyber attacker. And this scenario is based on similar attacks we've seen in the past. So it is pretty much a real scenario. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Dan. Dan, if you want to sort of set the scene a little bit from the attacker side, and yeah, we'll pick up from there in a minute.
Yeah, so as Maritz said, this is sort of a demonstration of how easy a phishing attack can be to conduct, and how easy it is to steal people's usernames and passwords. When an attacker is selecting a target, sometimes it's indiscriminate. Sometimes they'll just send emails off to thousands of different random accounts and see what comes back, but sometimes it's a bit more deliberate and targeted. So in this scenario, a hacker's selected Datamaniacs as a good organization to conduct an attack against, potentially because they've got loads of data. That's something you can use in a ransom, or additionally you can turn that into cash by trying to sell some of that data on the dark web. So organizations who have either a lot of cash or a lot of data are often good targets for an attacker. So what this is a tool called Go Fish, which is actually an educational tool for teaching people about phishing emails. But it could also, it's also used by attackers to send loads of different phishing emails off to different people. So some of the things that hackers will do prior to an attack, we can look at here. So within the GoFish tool, we can build a sending profile, and I'll just show you this quickly. So what the hacker's done in this instance is gone away and bought a domain that is very similar to Datamaniacs, but as you can see, there's a slight spelling discrepancy, which the hacker's hoping the victim won't notice when they receive an email. So this one, this particular campaign is purporting to be the Datamaniacs social committee, to try and trick the end user. What we can also do is draft a little email within this tool, which we've done here. The gist of this email, you'll see it properly in Maritz's Gmail in a second, but we're pretending to be the social committee. We're suggesting there's a new website you have to sign up to, and then again, a website that Maritz is going to get tricked into visiting with a slightly different spelling, which we're hoping nobody's going to notice. So what we can do within this tool, we can start a new campaign. We'll select that email template we were just looking at. We're selecting the sending profile as well with the slight discrepancy in the spelling. And we can go ahead and send Maritz a phishing email. So there we go, easy as that. And all that tool is doing now is populating a email in the background, making it look legitimate from that domain that looks very similar. And that was on its way to Maritz's desktop now. So I'll finish this is the end of this part of the demonstration, as on the attacker's computer, Maritz will show you what it looks like from the victim then.
Cool. So yeah, so coming back to my side then. So I've come in the morning. I've now connecting to my remote desktop, which is in the office. I sort of log in with my user credentials, and I was thinking, great stuff, let's do that. Great, so I can start my day. So in this case, the company uses Gmail. So I'll open up my inbox so I can sort of start doing a bit of work. And ultimately, if it loads, it's always when you do a technical demo, things sort of tend to slow down. And I see, well, actually, I've got an interesting email. Oh, I've got something from the social committee. Let's have a look. So opening up that email, well, okay, I know we've just come back we're sort of just on the way back from COVID. It's quite nice to sort of start kicking off the social side of things. And I know that there's been some talking about having some more beers and so on in the pub and so on. So cool. So let's have some fun. It's from social committee. Seems all right. They want me to log onto a new social platform. Let's do that. So it's social.datamaniacs.com.co.uk. Looks fine to me. Brilliant. So logging in. Great. So I can just log in using my Windows username and password. So I'll do that. That's great. Submit that. Thanks for joining in. Well, nothing much more is happening. I guess they'll probably send me an email later on. So I'm going to crack on with the rest of my work now. Yeah, let's see how the rest of the day goes. So I'm going to hand over back over to Dan now, actually, just to show you what they saw from what they sort of see from the attacker side once I've done that, because it looks fairly innocuous. Doesn't look like anything major is happening. Yep, Dan, over to you again.
Yes, so that website which you just saw Maritz enter his details into was a malicious website that the attacker in this scenario had set up. really easy to find an organization's logo and color scheme and the font that they use on their website. So that's pretty easy to do. And the domain looked pretty similar from that spelling discrepancy. So what's happened here is that instead of that username and password going off to the social committee, it's actually being logged on a malicious server that the attacker has set up. So all we need to do is go to the right part of the logging information, and you can see down here that Maritz has entered his name and his password, which we can capture. So that's the first thing we've managed to do using that phishing email. The next thing we need to do is to think about how we're going to get malware onto Maritz's computer. So malicious software like ransomware isn't something you can just go and download from Google. Malware authors often have to host those files somewhere where only they can get access to it. So what we're doing now is just starting a malicious server so we can download malware onto Maritz's computer. That's it, we've got a malicious server running here. What we can do now is log into Maritz's remote desktop while he's away at lunch. So all we need to do is put in his username. We've got his password from our malicious site, and we can go ahead and log in. Hopefully that doesn't take too long.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So the malicious actors now got access to Maritz's desktop. The first thing an attacker might be doing when he gains access is looking for some data he can take that might be worth something, either on the dark web or something that you can extort the end user for as part of a ransomware incident. So we can see on his desktop, Maritz has some customer data, and so yeah, we've got some fake customer data here with some bank details and addresses, something you don't want to go missing. We've also got some documents that appear to be quite valuable as well. So that's the first thing, we can steal some data. The next thing we want to do, download that ransomware we've served on our malicious server. We shall pop that onto the desktop. So it's easy as that, just downloading a small file onto Maritz's desktop, and we can go ahead and run that and start encrypting Maritz's files. So as you can see, that ransomware's run. It's got rid of the background. All of Maritz's data has now been encrypted. It's all gobbledygook. There's no way he can get that without the ransomware key, which has been taken by the malicious actors. And as you saw in the examples at the start, often there's a ransomware note that accompanies a ransomware attack. So along with Maritz's files being encrypted, there's also a ransomware note. Hello, data maniacs. You've lost all your files. They're encrypted. You won't be able to get them back. The only way you can get them back is if you pay some Bitcoin. Email us here to find out. If you don't pay, we'll publish all your data on the dark web at this address. So quite a bad day for Maritz when he gets home from gets back from lunch. What we'll also do is set a bit of a background. So set a background so when Maritz comes back, he's definitely going to know that he's been attacked. So yeah, that's sort of how easy it is to conduct a ransomware attack once you've gained access to a user's system. What we'll also do is just get rid of some of the evidence that we've been there as well. So just to make it a bit harder for any forensic examiners who will come and investigate this ransomware attack. But yeah, that was how easy it is to conduct a ransomware attack.
Cool, thank you, Dan. I guess just to prove again, that's the machine that I use on a day-by-day basis. When I log in, wow, I'm in deep trouble now. I've been hacked. I've kept all these files on my local machine. My boss is going to kill me. What do I do?
Do you want to share your screen, Marit? Just see.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah, sorry. There we go. Yeah, sorry, yeah. So when I logged in, I see this really panicking. And this is where, as you say, my day is getting bad. My boss's day gets bad. Potentially our customers' days get bad. So this is sort of a place where you don't want to be really in many cases. So just exit that. So I think one of the first things we probably can chat about. So see, is my screen is sharing? Yeah. I think Dan, you've obviously been involved in quite a lot of these sort of incidents. And do you have a couple of tips for us in terms of what you can do if you are actually subject to a ransomware attack?
Yeah, so sort of we'll go through a few tips on what to do in the event of a ransomware attack, and then a few tips on things to not do. So the first thing you really need to get sorted if something like this happens to your organization is to get the right people around you in the first instance. Your first port of call, should you be the victim of a ransomware attack or any type of cyber attack, would be your insurer, providing you have cyber security insurance. What will happen is you'll get put through to your account handler, and they'll be able to assist you with trying to find a legal team. Obviously, sometimes when personal data has been stolen, there are regulatory obligations to meet. So there'll be a legal team there to help you out. They'll also put you in touch with a digital forensics team, someone not too dissimilar to me and Marit's, to try and work out how this attack's happened, how you can better protect yourself in the future. And for the most part, the consultancy fees that are required to get you back to working order should be covered under your cybersecurity policy. If you don't have cybersecurity insurance, certainly as a start for 10, consider getting some. But let's say this has happened and you don't have any insurance, getting in touch with a forensics firm is probably a good port of call. They'll be able to help you do all the important things you need to get back to business as usual. So once you have that support system around you, they'll start looking at some of the technical aspects of how this attack has happened. Your first concern is isolating the infected devices. This should be your top priority, because ransomware can be quite nimble at times and work its way through your entire system. So of absolute paramount concern is ensuring that that ransomware is stopped in its tracks. As a second concern, you want to be looking at your backup policy, your backup system. The easiest way to recover from a ransomware incident is to just revert back to a recent backup, which should remove all malicious activity on whatever device it's impacted. However, ransomware authors are also familiar with backups and will often target those to prevent you being able to restore your systems back to business as usual. So yeah, after you've contained the incident, ensuring that your backups are safe and you can restore from those backups is your second concern. Third concern, and again, these are all things that your technical support team will be able to help with, is creating backups of those infected systems. There's a few reasons why we do this. First one is, whilst you're busy restoring all your systems, you can pass those backups to a forensic investigation firm who'll be able to go through those disk images and backups to try and find evidence of how this attack's happened, which is really important for preventing a similar attack from happening again in the future. Another important point about creating backups of the infected systems is that down the line, in a few months, maybe a year, it's possible that some decryption tools will become available to everyone. Security researchers are always trying to decode or work out how to decrypt information that's been compromised in a ransomware attack. So you may well be able to take those backups and decrypt them yourselves, get your data back without having to pay a ransom. Another important thing to try and do is identify the ransomware strain. There's actually a lot of free tools online which can help you identify what type of ransomware you've been the victim of. Often ransom notes are worded in very similar ways. So sharing the ransom note that Marit's just had on his desktop to one of these open source tools will usually be able to tell him what type of ransomware it is. The reasons why we want to understand what type of ransomware is it builds the case, and we get more evidence to understand whether or not information might have been stolen. So a key decision point should you be victim of a ransomware attack is trying to ascertain whether or not personal data has been stolen, because this has follow-on consequences for whether you have to report to the ICO, whether you have to report to data subjects. And some ransomware strains do steal data, some don't. So it's important information to try and capture. And the final point is deciding whether to pay the ransom. The gold standard answer is that you should never pay a ransom, as it sort of helps feed the ransomware community, and you're perhaps presenting yourself as an easy victim. You might be victim of a repeat attack, but we've experienced incidents where ransomware attacks will make or break your company. If you're a fairly small company and you're very your sales are very dependent on how much your customers trust you, losing data can sometimes be a business ender. So occasionally companies have to pay a ransom to survive. So there's always that option. Having gone through these types of incidents a few times, there's most forensics firms will have cryptocurrency on hand to be able to negotiate and get your data back. So back to the first point, it's very important to get the right people around you right at the start, as early as possible in one of these types of incidents. Do you want to go on to the next slide, right? So what not to do in the event of ransomware? As I said on the last slide, really important to try and isolate infected devices to stop the spread. But it's also important not to alter the state of the device. Back when ransomware first became a online threat, the sort of go-to reaction was to unplug and turn off all the devices that were potentially involved in the ransomware attack. As times moved on, it's been deemed in sort of the information security community that that's probably not the best course of attack, because when you turn a computer off or put it into hibernation or start doing things to that infected device, you're damaging or deleting evidence which could be useful to a forensic examiner who's trying to find out how that ransomware happened in the first place. So leaving a device in the state you found it is best practice. Obviously, you'll try and isolate around it with firewalls or virtual networks, but the actual device itself you should leave as untouched as possible. Also important is not connecting any external storage. Most ransomware is aware enough to know when a USB stick or a hard drive is plugged into the device it's on, and will try and copy itself onto the USB stick, that when it's plugged into a new computer, the ransomware will be able to spread that way. So unless directed by a forensic examiner who knows what they're doing, don't plug any external storage into an infected computer. Also important is not to pay the ransom immediately. In 90+% of the cases we've been involved in where the customer has been contemplating whether or not to pay a ransom, they are almost always negotiable. A small payday for a ransomware group is better than not getting paid at all. So often there's room for maneuver, not only on how much the ransom is, but also on the timelines. The threat of releasing your data in 10 days can be stretched a little bit, providing you're making contact and explaining that you're considering paying a ransom. Also important is not to communicate on any infected devices, particularly in the case of the example we just gave. If your device has been compromised via a phishing email, it is probable that a hacker, malicious actor can read your emails. So if he can see that you're talking to your lawyer or talking to a forensic firm, he'll have a bit of an idea of what kind of remediation activity you're undertaking, and also might try and delete emails from your lawyer or try and become a nuisance. So if you, when you're sending emails about an incident, do it on a clean device, on a clean network, or a separate network altogether. Also important is not deleting files for similar reasons to the altering its state. The less you do to a device that's been infected, the better preserved the evidence will be to try and find out what happened. But also some ransomware will notice file deletion and can warn the ransomware operator that you're trying to recover those systems, which might end up shortening your timeframes for response and all sorts of different things. So best practice is to not do too much to the device that's become infected. And the final point is not to trust ransomware authors. Increasingly nowadays, as Marit said earlier in the presentation, ransomware gangs are very business-like these days, and it is in their interest to have a reputation for returning data should somebody pay a ransom, so they can continue to operate. But not every piece of ransomware has been written by an organized criminal gang. Sometimes it might be a one-off individual who's trying to extort some money out of your organization. So there's no guarantee that should you pay a ransom that your data will be returned. So in the event of a ransomware attack at your organization, you really do need to weigh up all the pros and cons of paying or not paying a ransom, depending on the likelihood of you being able to recover yourself. Yeah, so that's sort of some tips for everyone on what to do and what not to do in the event of ransomware.
Great stuff. Thank you, Dan. It is quite an interesting topic, ransomware, and the fact that it's probably one of the few types of cyber incidents where you get to interact potentially with the attacker as well, which is quite a daunting prospect, which is why definitely the sort of getting the support that you need, making sure that you've got that support set up just in case this happens is absolutely key, so you don't have to deal with this sort of issue yourself, definitely. So sort of as part of the closing part of this webinar, we were just going to cover off some of the 5 key areas that you might want to consider in terms of the broader cybersecurity aspects as well. Because ultimately quite a few of the bits and pieces that Dan showed was the attacker exploiting some really basic stuff and some really basic weaknesses and vulnerabilities. But there's also a lot more sophisticated attackers out there as well. So cybersecurity is a broad topic, and it's quite different for different organizations as well. So where I'd like to start in terms of the sort of 5 key areas worth considering within the organization is, the first part is really sort of underlining the importance of senior management engagement in this specific risk. Ultimately, senior management of any organization does define the company's risk appetite and also sets the tone from the top generally. And especially when it comes to cybersecurity, that's normally sends a clear message whether cybersecurity is one of the company's priorities. And that's often a lead factor in determining how much time, money, and effort is spent in this area. So as a cybersecurity professional, I'm usually quite relieved when I walk into an organization and I can speak to a CTO, and the CTO or the CFO or the CEO can talk about cybersecurity and talk about how important that is to their business, because then they've got it. They sort of understand that it's a threat that faces most organizations. But the reality, unfortunately, is that boards and senior management, they've got a lot of competing priorities. We saw this in the last year. Everybody just trying to cope with COVID and the sort of lockdown side of things. So getting senior management involved in some of these topics, especially as it's sometimes seen as an IT problem, specifically cybersecurity, when it isn't, it's actually a broader business issue. Getting the board involved is quite difficult. And that's been recognized even at government level. So the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, have provided what they call a cybersecurity board toolkit. It's a really good starting point to help break down this barrier. It's a set of tools you can use to help senior management teams develop that understanding and appreciation for cybersecurity risk, specifically as it relates to their business. And again, it helps embed cyber security or security as a whole as a board level agenda item so that it doesn't get lost in the noise. The second part, and actually that's one of the first things that the toolkit also tells you to do or to guide you into doing, is understanding where your business's crown jewels are kept. I mean, ultimately, cybersecurity is conceptually quite similar to physically securing a home or office premises. You need to understand what is most important to protect and how valuable it is to you, how and where you're potentially vulnerable to break in, and how much you're willing to invest in protecting that property. So from a cyber standpoint, it's important to identify where you're particularly dependent on IT within the organization for continuity of operation. And it may be as simple as just your staff laptops and desktop computers or email environment, but it could also be other key business applications or computerized systems that you rely upon. The other aspect to consider as part of mapping out what's important to your business is also where you hold sensitive information. So that could be personal information, commercially sensitive, valuable intellectual property. And going back to our demo, are people, for example, storing a lot of sensitive information on their desktops, you know, on their own computers, or on areas where there's not really strong security? I mean, that will also help you determine where to focus your efforts and would give you an indication of the range of attackers to consider. For example, whether you might be susceptible to opportunistic cyber criminals. So you might not have a you might not be working in a particularly sensitive industry, or your members might not be in a particularly sensitive industry, but in other cases, they might actually be in quite a sensitive industry, and they might actually be targeted by well-resourced state-sponsored groups even. especially where companies are developing cutting-edge technologies. And we've seen that with the COVID vaccine as well, where vaccine companies were actually targeted specifically by cyber attackers. The other aspect to consider as part of mapping out where cybersecurity is important is understanding where your organization might be more susceptible to cyber attack. For example, like we've seen in the demo, your staff might not be particularly IT savvy and could be taken in by phishing emails. So you want to look at what controls you put in place to prevent that from happening. For example, good training, good security awareness, or even email filtering, strong email filtering, so that you can capture these sort of strategies and tactics that attackers do follow. Or you may actually run services that people can access on the internet. So where these services are public, it's quite likely that cyber criminals could also have a go at breaking in. So the first sort of key step I would do is making sure that you map out your environment and understand what it is you're trying to protect and why. The third step is encouraging everybody to adopt a framework. So we've got cybersecurity frameworks. There's a lot out there. So you don't have to figure all this out from scratch in terms of what you need to do. Ultimately, that's really where these cybersecurity frameworks come in quite useful. So we've got some really basic cybersecurity frameworks like Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus. Some of you might be aware of these, at least of Cyber Essentials, which provides you some of the basic cyber hygiene controls, things like making sure that computers are patched, you've got security patches applied, you don't operate with users that's got too much access on the systems, bits and pieces like that. So you might want to start with something like Cyber Essentials, because what that helps is potentially protect you against common cyber attacks, typically opportunistic cyber attacks, and cyber criminals who indiscriminately target the weakest in the pack through things like phishing, which we've just seen, compromised websites, and also exploiting vulnerable internet-facing services. As you mature and advance, you can go through a various number of upgraded frameworks, if you want to call it that. So we've got the National Cybersecurity, it's got 10 steps to cyber security. That's a really useful framework to pick up as well. And then ultimately you could evolve to some of the more advanced, more sort of integrated management type frameworks like ISO 27001. And ultimately the aim is to try and address all of the aspects of cybersecurity, both from a people, process, and technology part, because all of those three sort of key areas contribute to a sustained cybersecurity resilience within the organization. The other key part as well is actually just being able to detect whether you have been breached and actually being able to respond to that as well. So to Dan's point a little bit earlier about being prepared and getting the right people in, you also need to think a little bit like business continuity planning. What are you actually going to do if you are subject to a cyber attack? Or what are you going to do as an organization if you are subject to a ransomware attack? Have you thought that through? Have you actually got plans in place to help you respond to that? Or at least to give you a structure against which to make decisions so that you don't have to make decisions on the fly when you're under a very stressful situation like being attacked with ransomware. I mean, the key questions you want to sort of answer right from the start is, if you did have major theft or ransomware attack on your business, how would you respond? What would the immediate actions be? Who's responsible for managing an incident? Who should be involved? How do you deal with the legal and reputational issues potentially associated with a cyber attack? Basic stuff, even like how do you invoke your cybersecurity insurance cover? What are the sort of basic steps you need to take so that you don't have to panic at the time and go, we don't know what to do ultimately. So that's quite a key part, is looking at how prepared you are for a cybersecurity incident as well as an organization. And then the last area I'd like to highlight is the third party and your supply chain side of things, because ultimately your supply chain may actually be putting you at risk as well. They're just companies in their own rights. They're exposed to as many of the same cybersecurity risks you are. They often hold information about your organization, your staff, your customers. They could actually have direct access to your systems as well. For example, it might be your IT service provider. So ultimately their risk is also your risk. So what we're saying here is that you should start driving cybersecurity maturity all the way through your own supply chain as well, and understand the risks your suppliers pose to you, carry out some good due diligence on suppliers, and encourage the adoption of frameworks within your supply chain, such as Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001 as well. So that's the sort of 5 key areas that we recommend if you sort of step back and say, how are you going to approach the whole cybersecurity problem? Getting management buy-in, understanding your data and your IT environment, adopting a framework, planning an operational response to a cyber attack, and don't be exposed by weak security practices in your supply chain. So that sort of draws our session to a close to an extent. I've not seen any specific questions in the Q&A, but we have got a Q&A session, a question session now. So if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Great, so we've got a couple of questions already. So how often do attackers follow through with threats such as posting data on the dark web if no ransom is paid by the due date? And if data is published on the dark web, how easy is it to take down? So that's probably a question for Dan, actually. I don't know if you can see the Q&A questions there.
Yeah, so increasingly now, in the same, as ransomware gangs are increasingly professionalized, in the same vein that they want to have a reputation for giving you your data back if you pay a ransom, they also want to follow through with threats of posting your data. So it really comes down to the type of ransomware strain you have and the gang that's behind it. But for the most professional ones, they will usually follow through with publishing your data on the dark web. How easy it is to take down is very difficult. So the way they're usually shared is a private sale, perhaps. So a lot of the time you can't actually see who has your data and who it's being passed to. So I would suggest that if your data has been stolen and published on the dark web, you won't be able to take it down, nor will you even know who has it. So you are better off treating that as anyone can have access to your data in that event. And that's the way that ICO treats it as well. If they are investigating a company who has had data stolen and there is evidence to suggest that it's been leaked, it is assumed that anybody could get their hands on that afterwards.
And you could sort of think that could be potentially a significant issue with its personal data, because the implications are pretty wide in terms of then having to deal with it as a personal data breach, potentially contacting everybody that's been involved, telling them that their personal data is out on the public web. Yeah, it's not it won't be a good place to be, I think, generally. Hence the sleepless nights for many senior management teams if this sort of thing happens. We got another question from Janice, which says, do you have a view on whether cybersecurity insurance cover is essential? So we made another one for Dan, actually, because you've been working quite closely with some of the cyber insurance companies as well.
I guess essential's subjective depending on what kind of organization you're part of. But if I was the CEO or whatever of a company, I would purchase cybersecurity insurance as a priority or as an essential piece of risk management, purely because the risk of being attacked by the risk of being victim of a phishing attack or something is so high, far higher than a fire or somebody falling down the stairs or whatever that might be. And you'd take out insurance to cover those things. And the costs, should you have to remediate a cyber insurance, can spiral out of control, really. When you're paying for lawyers and consultants to come in and fix your IT, that's not something you want to be paying out of pocket. That's something you want to have already prepared for previously.
Thank you, Dan. We've got another question also. Are you more or less exposed to cybersecurity attack if you use a number of cloud-based services, such as CRM, Dropbox, mail distribution services, SurveyMonkey, etc.? I mean, it's an interesting question, because I guess the thing you need to consider is all of those services are exposed to the internet as well. That's third parties. They could potentially be hacked in their own right, which could potentially give people access to your services. I would say things like email, like Office 365, you're probably a little bit less exposed, but ultimately, take the example we had, if somebody gains access to one of your staff PCs or computers, then potentially they've got access to all those email systems. They potentially have access to Dropbox. They potentially have access to CRM as well. Also, if you're not particularly good at managing your credentials or usernames and passwords, then potentially the attacker could even log into those services as your staff and breach it that way. So I don't know if there's actually a scale that sort of puts you up against in terms of that. I think you're exposed regardless of the kind of technologies you use, unfortunately, and you need to make sure that what you need to make sure is you understand what the security issues are, or the security risks are with using those various services, and put the necessary controls in place to reduce the risk as far as you can. Dan, I don't know if you've got any extra thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it used to be when the cloud first became a thing and people were computing not within their internal infrastructure, it was their case that your on-prem stuff was more secure because you had more control over it, and that was sort of things you could go and touch and deal with. Whereas that wasn't quite the case when cloud first became a thing. These days it's come on leaps and bounds, and stuff that's in the cloud is as configurable and as part of your internal IT as your sort of on-premise infrastructure. So yeah, the line between cloud computing and on-prem computing is a lot more blurred now that cloud infrastructure's come on such a long way over the past 5 years or so. So I don't think there's no difference really between whether, in terms of exposure, to whether your services are in the cloud or on-prem.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. So we're sort of on 5 o'clock now, so we're pretty much at the end of the session. If there's any more questions, you will get a follow-up email from this from the session. I hope you found it useful. I hope you sort of got a bit of a feel for what it looks like from an attacker's perspective and also from the victim's perspective. I guess one of the things I'd highlight is there's no whiz bang about it really. It's quite low key. It's really difficult to detect often, and often the whiz bang, the sort of moment is when you get that ransomware note, for example, and by that stage it's way too late because there's a lot of stuff has actually happened in the background up to that point. So I just wanted to close by saying thank you very much for everybody for joining. Thank you for taking part in the Q&As, and yeah, we'll hopefully speak to each of you at some point. Thank you very much, guys.